All right.
Hi, everyone.
Nathan, how are you?
Great. How are you?
Excellent. So, folks, just last minute, RFM had an emergency. So he is not going to be part of tonight's show. He was actually in the studio 3 minutes ago and notified us that he had an emergency come up, and it is a real emergency. So please forgive him for not being part of the show tonight. We're going to have a lot of fun still. Maven's going to take his place and help me get through this. It'll be an easy episode, I think, to go over.
I could never take RFM's place.
Well, no, but also yes. So
his spot on the screen.
So this episode is actually probably the perfect one for this to have happened with. It was really more of an episode that will sort of read prompts off the screen. RFM told me his notes for tonight, and so we'll make sure that we fit those in as well so that at least his ideas are conveyed. And I'm going to change the layout here, and what we'll do is we'll jump into this. This was, as I was doing research over the last few months for the Rigdon-Spalding theory that we covered, this was a little side tangent that I had discovered. I wasn't the one who discovered it. It was written out in written form on a website. And I just thought it needed to be part of a podcast at some point, and put this together a few days ago because RFM was on vacation, and we had talked about maybe doing an episode where he could share his insights recently from the Book of Mormon. And because he was out of town, he wasn't going to have much time to prepare. So I put this together really quick. And I think it's please.
Oh, I did like what RFM said right before. I thought it would be a good kind of overall introduction to the subject, or I don't know if you want to do that now or if you had a different spot you wanted to.
I think I'll fit it in later, but I can at least mention that one of the points RFM makes is this is an incredible topic to sort of show that there are things in Joseph Smith's milieu that we sort of, when we learn Mormonism and the way the church presents its narrative, the church presents it as if this is this unique thing happening. For instance, the first vision is this unique thing that's happening. Meanwhile, what we're not told is that there are lots of people having first visions, and Joseph is just one of many. Also, one thing that our RFM reminded us is that when we learn that Jesus came and he's the Messiah, what we don't often get told that does happen in biblical studies is where we learn that there are lots of messiahs who come before Jesus and after Jesus who claim to be the one, and
who taught very similar things. Similar views.
And so Jesus isn't a unique thing. He's one of many messiahs who claim to be the Redeemer of Israel. So, yeah. Any other thoughts maybe before we jump in?
No, that's it. I think that's a great context to dive in.
Sweet. So let's do it. So with the first slide here, I'll start out here. I'll read this one. By the way, that's Christopher Walken. I won't do my Christopher Walken voice to tell you this, but this was sort of humorous. This is
everybody.
This is Christopher Walken as Colonel Angus, which, folks, if you know, you know. So March of 1823, Colonel Abraham Edwards, and there's two places in the slideshow where I use an image of somebody who is not the person we're talking about. I just wanted to make this a little more fun. March of 1823, Colonel Abraham Edwards, a prominent Detroit entrepreneur, discovered a deteriorating parchment manuscript written in curious hieroglyphics hidden up within the foundation of an old Detroit house. And so that in and of itself is kind of cool. Hieroglyphics, there's an old document, seems to be ancient, and it happens in 1823. And it makes the news. Maybe you want to read this one?
Yeah. All right. Almost immediately, this discovery became the subject of considerable discussion, resulting in the manuscript being placed on public display at the local newspaper office, whereupon the editor provided his readers with reports of the intriguing discovery. Since none of the locals was able to read or even to identify the strange text, examples of a few pages of the text were eventually sent to various philologist experts for examination.
Yeah. And so this was a newspaper article in Michigan, in the area of Detroit, that was referencing this discovery. It says the manuscript, the singular volume recently discovered by Colonel Edwards, has been compared with more than 30 different alphabets, ancient and modern. And although the characters in which it is written bear a slight affinity to several of them, it is very clear that they belong to neither. They bear more resemblance to the Phoenician alphabet than any other with which they have been compared, though a number of letters differ but little from the Saxon. And then it has a dash there, but then it just says, there is no doubt from the Latin sentences interspersed through it. It is a religious work, and it is probably the production of some learned theologian of the 17th century, written in a peculiar cipher. And I want to note before we continue, again, this is connected to the Rigdon-Spalding theory, and this extra way of putting things together requires even more conjecture than the Rigdon-Spalding theory did. And so I don't accept this as the connection that they later make to Mormonism. I don't accept that. But there are really cool things about this moment in history and how it connects to Mormonism regardless. And I think you'll find that to be true as well. Okay.
Can I address? I wanted to bring up this comment. Should I finish watching the Rigdon-Spalding video before this one? I think that was done on purpose, combining the names there. And I think just to piggyback off of what you were saying, I don't think you really need to know all the details and particulars. You can definitely watch that after this one. But what's important to know is just that this type of thing, the Rigdon-Spalding theory is really just one that there's a document, or there was a document at the time, that Joseph Smith could have used as a starting point or as a source for the Book of Mormon. And so, Bill, you can add to it if there's anything more to that needs to be understood for this episode. But I think that's basically it. So, yeah.
Yeah, folks, you can watch this on its own. It will have its own merit, and you will not need to really know the Rigdon-Spalding theory to make sense of this issue. So yeah, absolutely, Maven. All right, so let me go to the next slide here. And I just want to say this connects to Mormonism for sure, at least in one way, which is this document that is in hieroglyphics. It was like 300 pages or something. It wasn't a small document, I don't believe. It got sent to lots of folks who were experts in little known languages. And one of those that this document got sent to was the Dr. Samuel L. Mitchell of New York City. And if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the gentlemen that the Anthon transcript was taken to be looked at. Besides Charles Anthon, it was taken to other experts, and I believe one of those is Dr. Samuel L. Mitchell of New York City. And so you have essentially the same guy that looks at this as the guy that later on looks at the Anthon manuscript from Mormonism. And that could be just a coincidence, and maybe it isn't. Let me read this one, Maven, and I'll put this one full screen, and then I'll let you take the next one. All right, so as the weeks passed and the mystery deepened, details of the affair were covered and copied at length by various newspapers from Michigan eastward throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New England, and even Canada. Eventually, some knowledgeable investigators recognized that the manuscript was a Roman Catholic religious text, which had apparently originated in Ireland and was partly written in an obscure form of early shorthand script dating back to the 16th century. And the document is some sort of legitimate thing. It's discovered. It's not like it's a made up text. But when it's discovered, for just a brief moment, it gets tons of interest from the local media. It makes its way into lots of newspapers. And for a few weeks or maybe a month, it gets discussed because everybody's taking it seriously. Everybody thinks this is some ancient document that got found. And so it's at least interesting in that within a few years of the Book of Mormon, you have someone discovering a text with an ancient language and sending it around, trying to get it examined and sort of translated or figured out what it is, which again connects to Joseph Smith going to having Martin Harris go to New York with the characters and trying to get a official expert opinion on those. So we'll move on. Maven, you want to read this one?
Yeah, I did want to say, I think something similar happens today with, testimonials, whenever there's any kind of sham thing or woo going on, or I mean, even financial fraud, there's always attempts to look like you've got some legitimacy through either through experts or uh, yeah, just pretend testimonials from people supposedly saying that something works. So I think this idea or this desire to get legitimacy is it's something that still happens today. So all
And
right.
I should add too, the good example of that, Maven, is the little 2-inch by 2-inch gold plates that were found recently. That
Mhm.
all of Mormonism, all of the Mormons, the believers within the faith, jumped on and got so excited about. And in the video about those plates, there were experts who gave their opinion and shared what these things were. So I think, at least to what you're saying, it happens even within the last 6 months. These kinds of things have gone on.
Right, right. It was concluded that Catholic monks likely brought it was concluded that Catholic monks likely brought the old text to the Detroit area in the early 18th century to evangelize local Indians. The manuscript's strange hieroglyphic-like symbols baffled early investigators who speculated it might be written in ancient Saxon, Phoenician, or Sumerian. This unusual aspect attracted significant national attention as the Detroit News reports were widely and accurately reprinted.
Yeah. And Colonel Abraham Edwards, the man who initially unearthed the strange manuscript, was an occasional business partner of a certain Detroit resident named Stephen Mack. Now, that name might sound familiar. I think it's mentioned in Lucy Mack's history. This is the same Stephen Mack who was both a maternal uncle to Joseph Smith Jr. and a cousin to the Book of Mormon's witness, Oliver Cowdery. And so this is just a random photo of an old man, but I put it up there just so that we could have something, I guess, to associate with Stephen Mack. There are no historical photos of him, just as there are no historical photos of Colonel Abraham Edwards that found the document. So I did try to find those, but no luck. Okay, Maven.
Messrs. Edwards and Mack reportedly ran a boat building business along the Connecticut River, but first collaborated in the Detroit Pontiac area after the War of 1812. Stephen Mack moved from Vermont to Detroit in 1810 for business opportunities and served in the American Army during the war. He relocated his family to Detroit in 1822, traveling west via the Genesee Road through Palmyra to Buffalo and then by lake to Detroit.
Yeah. And by an odd coincidence, Stephen Mack's cousin, Oliver Cowdery, first left Vermont at almost exactly the same time. According to one of Oliver Cowdery's old schoolmates, Highland Paul, the young Oliver attended school in the Wells district of Vermont in 1821 and 1822. Oliver then went to Palmyra. Probably this means that young Cowdery finished his schooling in his hometown of Wells during the winter term, lasting from after the fall harvest in 1821 until the spring planting season of 1822, and then joined the annual immigration of New Englanders to Western New York. And there's an image there that shows the migration route that folks were taking at the time. And at least this person who wrote the website explaining about the 1823 Detroit Manuscript and its connection to Mormonism felt like Cowdery would have likely taken this same path. I don't know that, and I didn't have the time to investigate that side tangent, but maybe Dan Vogel or someone else in the chat might know. But anyway, okay.
There is no proof, but Oliver Cowdery could have traveled with the Mack family migration. Stephen Mack likely visited his sister, Lucy Mack Smith, offering a chance for Joseph Smith Jr. to join them to Buffalo and then to Ohio, where Oliver's brother lived near Sidney Rigdon. This proximity allowed opportunities for Cowdery, Rigdon, and Smith to meet, though official LDS history denies they knew each other before 1830. LDS history asserts Cowdery met the Smith family in late 1828 and Rigdon met Smith and Cowdery in late 1830. Cowdery's early life remains largely unexamined in LDS accounts.
Yeah, and I'll just note a couple things. One is that the author of this, you can tell sort of the language. And by the way, I took the text off of the website where this story's told. When this episode completes, I will put the resources, and I usually don't do that beforehand because I want people to sort of be intrigued by it rather than be able to sort of read it beforehand and then not watch the episode. So two things. One is that the writer of the article, I took the material and I put it into ChatGPT and told them to synopsize it, but it still carried through the tone of the author, which he believes in the Rigdon-Spalding theory. I would word this differently if I was the one writing it. I wouldn't have as much sort of belief that that's what happened and that the church was being dishonest about the connection of Rigdon and Cowdery and Smith. The other thing I'll note that is kind of unique in Mormonism is that Oliver Cowdery is the second cousin of Joseph Smith, and we get told that all the time. And I just want to note that I've never remembered any evidence presented in Mormonism that Smith and Cowdery were well aware that they were second cousins or that they had had any interaction prior to Cowdery showing up to help translate the Book of Mormon. And it's sort of like in my head, the way I look at it is I know sometimes you can, like, I think the church even has a site where you can do this. You can put your name in and your family tree in, and it'll connect you to other people. So you find out you're the fourth cousin of John F. Kennedy. And you're like, oh, wow. Well, you didn't know that until that moment. And I don't know that Smith knew he was related to Cowdery as he's interacting with him. We know after the fact, but I've never seen, and again, Dan Vogel can jump in, I've never seen any evidence that Smith and Cowdery were well aware of each other prior to Cowdery showing up to translate the Book of Mormon. That may be the case, but I've never known that. And at the very least, what it says is that the church did what this guy says in the last sentence, that Cowdery's early life remains largely unexamined in LDS accounts. So there's that.
I did want to point out some potential presentism there, which is that in our modern day where travel is so much easier and it's a lot easier to be away from and lose track of family. I think things might have been a bit different then, and I think people did know more about their extended family members, even if they were further away and travel was difficult. I feel like family connections was important, and they did keep track of those things. So that's still a possibility and something that wouldn't maybe necessarily make it into record. But yeah, just again to throw that out there.
And then to add to that, in this specific instance, Dan Vogel's saying, no, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery didn't know each other before the 5th of April, 1829. And so there's that. But you're right, Maven. Maybe Joseph Smith Sr. And if Oliver's saying who his parents are, maybe, or Lucy Mack is making the connection. So I think there is room for that. But I think, as Dan pointing out, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of any knowledge of each other at the time. Okay.
Yeah, correct. I was just putting out a possibility.
Yep.
I did just want to share this real quick about the Erie Canal when you were talking about the trail that they would go through. Doug says the Erie Canal was not finished until 1825, but parts of it were used before it was finished. And so, yeah, if anyone wants to point out that as a discrepancy, thank you, Doug, for pointing that out.
Sweet. All right. Did you read the last one or did I?
I don't remember.
I think maybe it was you. Okay.
It was, yeah, I think it's your turn.
The Detroit Manuscript story broke early that year, covered by newspapers in Canandaigua, New York. I hope I pronounced that right. Near Joseph Smith, Pulteney, Vermont, near Oliver Cowdery, and Pittsburgh, the home of Sidney Rigdon. The media focus was on the manuscript's undecipherable symbols. Given Oliver Cowdery's involvement in the newspaper business in 1823 and his cousin Stephen Mack's connection to Detroit, this person posits that it's likely, I would want to be a little more ambiguous than that, but he says it's likely Cowdery and Smith took an interest in the story. What I would tend to say is that this story was in their milieu. There's at least a chance, and maybe a good chance, they would have been aware of this event happening. But I also don't know of any evidence that would show that they absolutely knew the story, and hence likely is sort of a strange word, I think, in the context of what's going on. I think it's possible. And maybe no effort to say how little or how great the chance of that is. Okay, go ahead, Mary.
Yeah. Stephen Mack died on November 11th, 1826. Around this time, Oliver Cowdery returned to Kirtland, Mecca, New York, where he may have met Sidney Rigdon, now a Reformed Baptist preacher. If they met, they likely discussed their shared Christian restorationist beliefs and the Detroit Manuscript, anticipating more ancient text discoveries that could lead to a restoration of apostolic Christianity.
And the only cool connection here, and there isn't anything connected to, like, they're done for let me say it differently. The Kirtland in Ohio is named after, I got to find it here, Dr. Jared Potter Kirtland, I believe it is. No, Judge Turhan Kirtland. I'm sorry. Judge Turhan Kirtland, the Kirtland, Ohio, as well as the Kirtland, New York, that is mentioned here are both named after the same person. Just sort of maybe a strange fact. Has nothing to do necessarily with one being connected to Kirtland, Ohio. I just want folks to recognize when it says Cowdrey returned to Kirtland, we're talking about Kirtland, New York, which is now known as Mecca, New York. And both Kirtland, Ohio and Kirtland, New York were named after the same person, some early American that had heavy influence, but no relationship to Mormonism. All right.
I like
Inquiring
this
mind.
comment.
Oh, please.
Oh, about
Yeah.
the last one,
Mhm.
it says, "Is it not safe to assume that they did learn about the relationship later and that knowledge of the relationship allowed a different kind of bond than they otherwise would have had?" I think that's a great theory. That's how I think a lot of things work, that when you find out a connection that you didn't know you had with a stranger, no matter how small that connection can be, it can form the basis of a new relationship for sure. So, yeah.
I think anytime, I mean, just in sociology or evolutionary science, psychology, anytime we learn something about someone without any other information, good or bad, we sort of, as long as that information isn't bad, especially when it's a relationship, we sort of build a level of trust and loyalty to somebody. So I think that's a great point. Okay, inquiring minds want to know. I wanted to use that phrase because this next thing here reminds me of sort of the National Enquirer, which is often putting together crazy stories and needing a lot of allowances and conjecture for something to be true. At this point, the question naturally arises, did Sidney Rigdon then possess an unusual manuscript of his own, one that did promise an American millennium complete with Israelite Indians? The charge has long been made that Sidney Rigdon obtained just such a manuscript, Solomon Spalding's, which purported to deal with the history of a once Christian ancient America. Did Sidney Rigdon pass along this secret? Did Sidney Rigdon pass along this secret to Oliver Cowdery in 1826? And did Cowdery telling his cousin, Joseph Smith Jr., about Rigdon's literary treasure bring to both cousins recollections of the curious details surrounding the Detroit Manuscript and how learned academics were unable to decipher the contents of such a sealed book? So it sounds sort of scandalous, and you need a lot of ifs to make this work. I don't believe this again, but again, we'll get to why this is interesting here in a moment. I'll just say here, we do have a date for Oliver Cowdery, and I don't remember if it's his brother but it's definitely his relative, Oliver and William Cowdery, at Newark in 1827, having letters at the post office. This is sort of similar to that Sidney Rigdon. It puts Cowdery at the right place at the right time for such a thing to be possible, that Cowdery has letters at the post office that need to be picked up. And this was from the Lyons Advertiser, November 27th, 1827. This is the earliest documented date for Oliver Cowdery's presence in New York. So there's that.
I
Dan
had a
here is,
thought too.
yeah, please.
Oh, go ahead. Well,
Oh, I'll
just
just,
about the last
okay, go ahead.
slide,
Yeah, go ahead.
and it's just the, oh, sorry, I think we're both doing it. I'm gonna put it to the next slide. So
Hmm.
it's, just the very last line here about how learned academics being unable to decipher the context. I just think that, this is again something that is really prevalent in conspiracy-minded type circles. I think as average laymen, when there are things that we don't understand, and it seems like even the experts don't understand, I don't know if it's like some bit of like Schadenfreude or something that it makes us happy. And it's for some reason it's a very tantalizing piece of information to tell people that even the experts don't know why this is or why that is. And it's often the way that misinformation it can be introduced, especially in the scientific community. Scientific, bad scientific claims or bad medical claims are made by saying that the scientists don't know why this is, or they don't know why this product that I happen to be selling is going to be the cause to solve your problems, whatever they are. Or even with anthropology, with archaeology, when the people who think that giants existed, or other humanoid species or that aliens came to Earth. It's always archaeologists, found this thing and they can't figure it out, and it's because of my pet theory here. So it's just interesting to see that those parallels still, like, just we're just as human beings, a human species, this kind of stuff is, I guess, we're just really susceptible to.
Yeah, I was just the other day looking up videos on petroglyphs. We got a lot of petroglyphs here in southern Utah. And I just went on a hike with a friend and looked at the petroglyphs. And I came back to my home and watched a few videos online about petroglyphs. And one of the videos was, is this evidence of ancient aliens? And just because there's a weird drawing with a person on a rock with 3 fingers on each hand instead of 5, we suddenly jump to like, oh, could be, maybe it is. So there's that. All right, let me note what Dan here is saying. Joseph Smith was already talking about the plates in 1823, long before Cowdery came. So if this person's going to posit that this whole idea comes together when Cowdery visits Smith, that makes little sense because Smith is already talking about a record being buried. Dan, I would be interested, by the way, if you have that reference or any of the references that happened before this 1823 date. I think it would be interesting for our audience to see what Joseph is claiming about the plates. In other words, he's a treasure digger. Gold buried in the ground is no big deal. That's sort of standard for what he says. And at what point does he start claiming that these are not only gold in the ground, but these are plates with writing on them and they're an ancient record? And so I would be very intrigued, Dan, if you don't mind grabbing those sources and putting up the text of them. I think folks would be really interested in seeing how early and to what degree Joseph is describing the plates and the fact that it is a written record of the ancient inhabitants. I think that would be cool. Just again, noting there's the mail waiting. And so Maven, I'll let you take this one.
All right. Was it only coincidence that on September 21st, 1827, a mere 10 months after his uncle Stephen had passed away, Joseph Smith allegedly discovered a manuscript of his own, one which also just happened to be written in an indecipherable collection of hieroglyphics? And was it also mere coincidence when, in early 1828, Smith copied out a sample of those indecipherable symbols for his financial backer, Martin Harris? The sample thus produced was the so-called Anthon Transcript, which, thanks to David Whitmer's careful preservation, exists to this very day. At least something was thus preserved, which is probably either a full or partial copy of that much mentioned Anthon transcript.
Yeah. And they obviously here, he's using the word manuscript incorrectly. We're talking gold plates, which turn into, maybe you could use the word manuscript with 116 pages, for instance, but the original record would be gold plates, obviously. And again, there's lots of ifs here. Was it only a coincidence? Well, probably. That Stephen passed away and Joseph Smith discovers again, a record of his own. So there's that. So they're trying to connect these dots. The person who wrote the article is trying to connect these dots, make it as likely with language as possible, trying to sort of manipulate all of us into thinking the connection is strong. But I don't see it, and you're welcome to, but I don't. Okay, so here is the Anthon manuscript, and these are the characters. I always thought it was interesting that they start off writing big, and then by the end they're writing super small, and they should have maybe just taken up a little less space on the front end so there was room to get all of it in. And folks there's been tons of research. Oh, by the way, I want to just say this here too. When the manuscript is taken to Charles Anthon, when Martin Harris leaves there and comes back, Martin Harris, Joseph Smith, the church, they tell a certain narrative about what that visit was like. And I would suggest for anybody unfamiliar with that event that Charles Anthon did 2 interviews with a newspaper journalist. And those 2 interviews make their way into a newspaper twice. One interview once, another interview different time. And he recounts the story of what happened. And I simply want to say that Charles Anthon's version of what happened when Martin Harris brought the characters to him is very different than the church's narrative. There are I'm just looking at one of the comments. Well, it's hard to pace. Yeah, well, it's hard to pace engraving, but Anthon's description of the events are different than Joseph. There is overlap with the churches, with Martin Harris's, but I would highly recommend that folks interested in the background story of Charles Anthon would go read his own explanations of what that event was like, and you will see that it is a very different version in terms of Anthon's acceptance and excitement around the Anthon, or the characters that were brought to him. So folks should definitely
I
take a look at that.
I believe he tried to inform poor Martin that he was being duped for his money,
Yes,
if I
that's
recall.
his claim. And there are
Yeah.
interesting things in regards to Anthon reporting that the Nephite interpreters sort of hurt Joseph's eyes, and hence he had to use a seer stone. There is some reference, I can't remember exactly what it is, but there is a couple of cool data points that sort of maybe even support Mormonism in a way. But for the most part, his testimony runs counter to the church's version. Okay. Whose turn? Is it my turn?
It's your turn.
Okay. The person that Martin Harris hastened to visit in an effort to identify the symbols in Joseph Smith's recently uncovered Nephite record was none other than Dr. Samuel L. Mitchell. So again, same guy, whose picture is shown at the beginning of the presentation, not the webpage. The renowned savant who had initially been unable to decipher similarly odd symbols from the Detroit Manuscript. Was this 1828 pilgrimage of Martin Harris really his own idea, or was it just one element in a carefully crafted scheme to gain publicity and believers for Smith's forthcoming literary wonder, the Book of Mormon? In other words, if Smith is aware of the 1823 Detroit Manuscript, and he's aware because of newspaper accounts that Dr. Samuel Mitchell took a look at it and was unable to translate it or decipher it, it would then make sense for Joseph to plant the idea in Martin Harris's mind of taking the characters, which are not any language specifically and might be bits and pieces of multiple languages, which again would make it impossible to decipher, and then take it to the same person, Dr. Samuel Mitchell, and have him take a look at this one, which he will also not be able to decipher, and who seems willing to have people come in with artifacts or ancient documents or manuscripts and take a look at them if they have a strange language on them. And so I think that's at least interesting. And that point doesn't require the Rigdon-Spalding theory at all. It simply requires that Smith is aware of the 1823 Detroit Manuscript and sees Dr. Samuel Mitchell as a viable way to get a professional opinion, and that opinion won't be able to do much with it. Hence, it supports the sealed portion, the response that they run with when they get back, when Martin Harris gets back from visiting him. So there's that. Okay.
A remarkable study undertaken by Richard B. Stout, in which that researcher compared the symbols on the Anthon Transcript with both Irish Ogham ciphers found in the 14th century Book of Ballymore and with certain symbols used early in the development of modern shorthand. According to Mr. Stout, he found a significant degree of correlation between Joseph Smith's characters and both of these old means of communication. Now, that's interesting to me. That is very interesting. I do wanna say, when it could be a coincidence, and I do also want to apologize for any mispronunciations I might have, just made there with the Irish, but, um, people again, coincidences can be coincidences. Sometimes, I think coincidences are overly used again in conspiratorial thinking, to especially when it comes to Smith and Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon and how they may or may not have met each other. And I think you've been great with this, Bill. They may have met, they may have known, but just because it's a coincidence that, 10 months after the death of one, that, families ended up together, I don't know. It's just all very, very normal sounding to me. And I think
Yeah.
you're about to
Yeah.
make a good there we go.
Yeah. I was actually linking up to the call-in studio and muted myself for a moment and didn't quite catch it. But I think you make a good point. I think we should expect to find, as events like this unfold, first off, is 10 months a coincidence? Like 2 days, maybe a week? So you can sort of go like, is it just a coincidence that 2 years after, and you can make it whatever time you want to, and you can sort of have it be close enough that it can relate. Such doesn't necessarily make it a coincidence. And we should expect coincidences. They happen all the time. If you look around you, coincidences are always occurring, whether you want to attribute them to the mundane or whether you want to attribute them to God. It certainly seems like they occur all the time. Okay, so there's that. And so, yes, I think you're right. This is very interesting. A remarkable study by Richard B. Stout he's noting that there are similarities between some of these languages that would have been available to Joseph Smith to take symbols from, and the characters of the Anthon transcript. And it would make sense if Joseph is going to write things down that he wouldn't just grab characters from one place, that he would mix it up so as to make it undecipherable. And so there's that.
I think that, and when it's difficult for human beings to just make things up wholesale, and so if a language is going to be made up, or characters like this are going to be made up, it's almost impossible not to use inspiration from other things that we know, to be able to do that. And someone even said that about, names that Joseph was, I mean, the names that he made up for what, angels and men, and I don't know, just how he, like, it
Englishmen,
sounded
yeah.
Germanic. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like the Adamic tongue seemed almost Germanic, or just very, very close to Joseph's English. That's just kind of how we are. Our brains, especially at this point in life, like, they're very flexible when we're young, but once we've got language that's, embedded into us, it's really difficult to think outside of the box and create something brand new that could be unrelated to what we know. So it's interesting to me, not because it really proves anything one way or another, or makes a statement about Mormonism. That's not what I'm saying, but it makes sense is all. Yeah.
I was just going to look up really quick Joseph Smith's thing there with the Englismen and see if I can't capture this here.
Yeah.
Let me put it over on the other screen, and then
It's
I'll
too bad we
share
don't have
this.
a picture of some of those ciphers, and maybe I can be looking for that just to kind of compare. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you happen to have it? That's not on a later slide,
Mm-mm.
is it? Okay.
No. I've got some things on later slides that do have some of these symbols, so we'll see if that's what
Oh,
you're
okay.
talking about.
Okay. Yeah.
I just want to note here, you're 100% right, Maven. Joseph Smith shows that he does something. If we're going to claim that he is taking symbols from other languages and presenting them as Reformed Egyptian, he sort of is doing the exact same thing here, where he takes words in English, changes them just a little bit, and then claims that this is the Adamic language. And once we understand the science of how languages develop, this becomes absurd, to the point where, if folks remember, we did an episode where we talked about this, and we pointed out that even Gordon B. Hinckley sort of probably knew the ridiculousness of this and posed this issue in a very different way, about Mormon meaning more good. And so this idea of what is the name of God in pure language, it's amen. Like, oh, after the end of a prayer, I say amen. Well, this is amen. Well, what is the name of the Son of God? The Son, English, amen. That's absurd. What are angels called in the pure language? Amen, Engelsmen. I mean, this is a guy making shiz up as he goes, and it's demonstrable. In fact, to the point where, if you remember, I asked Jacob Hansen if, after I showed him this slide, I said, Jacob, do you think Joseph Smith understood the Adamic language? And even Jacob Hansen had to go, no, which I thought was quite telling. So anyway, there's that. So thank you for bringing that up. Here are some of the symbols from one of the documents. I don't remember which it is, but this is one of the documents. Oh no, this is the book. This is the thing that what's his name found, the Colonel Abraham Edwards. And so these are some of the symbols and stuff that were in it. And this is a page from the book. There's 3 or 4 pages. If you do a search for the document, go back to the earlier slides, folks, rewind it, and you can copy and paste that into a Google. or just type it out into Google and do a search, you'll find that there are 3, 4, 5 pages of this document online. There may be a whole copy of the thing somewhere, but these are the sort of hieroglyphics that are on there. Again, not hieroglyphics, but this is what they thought were hieroglyphics. And you can see why they would think that. It's weird looking chicken scratch. And it makes sense that folks would sort of not know exactly what that is. I also want to note this has nothing to do with it. This was on Etsy, but this was a cipher wheel. And one of the languages that you just read were part of this, I think, was the Ogham, Ogham. Let me go back to.
Yeah, on the third line there at
Yeah,
the
Ogham
end.
ciphers, Irish Ogham ciphers. And so this has Theban, Ogham, Enotian, and Celtic, and each of the languages. So you sort of could, turn the wheel to a certain spot and you would know what that character is in all the languages. So that's interesting. And again, it's got letters on there, but there's also symbols that we would all sort of go, I don't know what that is. Maybe that's hieroglyphics. So that makes sense.
I just
Okay.
want to actually kind of maybe like go
Please.
back and back and forth between like this and see if we're seeing some of those because I especially with there's some of his that are really long that just look like a lot of just parallel lines together,
Yeah.
but there are other ones in between I think that do actually kind of look a bit if we kind of switch back and forth. That might be interesting for someone to sit down and really look at them all together.
Yeah, and
Anyway, back
somebody
to you.
actually does. Oh, you're good. Somebody actually
Oh,
does.
okay.
I'll show an image here
Oh,
where
perfect.
you will see the character from a different language that Joseph Smith would have had access to, and its counterpart on the Anthon manuscript. So even with Stout's discovery, it's unlikely Joseph Smith reused the same transcript Colonel Edwards sent to Dr. Mitchell in 1823. If Smith had, Mitchell would have recognized it and dismissed it as a copy. In other words, Mitchell's already seen this other document purported to be an ancient text, which turns out to not be. It would not make sense for Joseph Smith, to use all of those same symbols and send it back to Dr. Samuel Mitchell, because you would run the risk that he would go, wait a minute, this looks exactly like the thing that was brought to me a few years ago. And you wouldn't want that to happen. So what you would do is maybe use a couple of them, but you would want to pull other symbols from other languages, and you wouldn't want too many symbols from any one language or shorthand, because you would want it to look completely like a foreign language. So thus the symbols Smith gave Martin Harris in 1828 couldn't have been identical to those from 1823. However, Smith could have obtained pages from the Detroit Manuscript, maybe, and sent Mitchell altered versions mixed with other symbols produced from actual Egyptian inscriptions or alchemist symbols. Again, it is posited by D. Michael Quinn, the late D. Michael Quinn, and others, that Smith tutored under, oh man, the name just slipped me, Luman Walters. And Luman Walters was involved as an alchemist. And so there is some idea, at least from D. Michael Quinn, that perhaps Smith may have learned some of the alchemist sort of stuff from Walters. And so the alchemist symbols, proofreader marks, Masonic ciphers. Again, Smith doesn't join Masonry until the 1840s, but Smith's brother, maybe brothers, and certainly his father were Masons at this time. Masonic ciphers or descriptions of Mayan glyphs and forgotten alphabets provided in popular press by reporters like Professor Konstantin S. Raffinske. I'm not going to pronounce that right. And by the way, that's a picture of him. He's a handsome man. I don't know how his life played out. But anyway, he's a
Can I
darling fellow.
I just wanted to add, this might be for our younger members of the audience because I think the older members will know, but there is an English shorthand, and I know I've met people who thought that shorthand might be just like leaving out vowels when or even just what we do in texting, like when we'll do TXT for text or TH, X for thanks. I'm going to put this up. This is English shorthand. And so back before typing became ubiquitous and something that all of us do, reporters, journalists, people, a lot of people did learn this system of writing, and it's something that you can still learn today as a way to be able to very quickly transcribe things. Of course, that has to be translated or transliterated later, but this is this is English. So these kinds of like writing systems, even playing around with our own language and different versions of our own, existed, and I believe existed at the time of Joseph Smith.
And there's no way I would have saw that shorthand and had any clue without training or some sort
Right.
of folks showing me what those symbols meant. So it is you
You
could
used to be able to take courses in it. Yeah. Yeah.
to the average person, something like that is like we say the cliche is it's Chinese to us. We don't have a clue what that is. So there's that. Okay. All right, back to the handsome fellow. We'll move on here.
Did you want the banner up or not quite yet?
Oh yeah, let's put it up. We can put it up because we're getting to the end.
Okay.
Yeah, there's
All right.
27 slides. So
I'll
let's
go ahead and read because I think, is it my turn?
please.
It is my turn, right?
Yeah, we'll skip
Okay.
to the next one, right? Yep.
Yeah.
This one.
I'll,
Yeah,
I'll
let me
skip
talk.
reading this one though.
Yeah. You're not gonna be able to. So this is just on the left is various symbols that would have been known or at least accessible to Joseph Smith in his day um, by this Raffenske, whatever. And then in the right is a showing the characters from the Book of Mormon. You're like, oh, well, maybe some of those overlap, maybe they don't. I'll let you read this, and we'll show here in a moment some of the correspondence between the symbols in various places and the Anthon transcript.
By styling such as a mix as quote unquote reformed Egyptian, Smith could use widely circulated Egyptian writing samples. Combining bits of Egyptian script with symbols from the 1823 Detroit Manuscript and his own scribbles, he created an indecipherable quote unquote sealed book. Regardless of future advances in Egyptian translation, Smith's Nephite writing, quote unquote, would remain unintelligible without the special spectacles provided with the quote unquote Golden Bible. Mormon polemicists have noted similarities between the Anthon transcript and the Egyptian hieroglyphics for decades. RLDS President Israel A. Smith's 1942 article, The Language of the Book of Mormon, compares Egyptian demotic symbols with the Anthon transcript, suggesting some symbols may be derived from Egyptian. Other writers note resemblances between Joseph Smith's markings and Mayan glyphs reported by Professor Raffin, I also don't know how to pronounce that, in 1827, despite his incorrect identification of Mayan glyphs as Libyan alphabets.
Yeah. Okay. And so here's the one I just thought this was interesting. So in each of the gray squares, you have the Anthon manuscript. I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. The Anthon transcript. And in those characters, and then to the right, you have the Egyptian character that is extremely similar. And by the way, I think there is a lot of similarity, more than what my brain says would be sort of a normal expectation of how close these symbols would look. And so, folks, if you look at those, you're going to notice there is some strong overlap in Egyptian symbols versus the Anthon transcript. And so I think that's cool. I don't think it's evidence of Reformed Egyptian being on gold plates. I think it's more reasonable to see a connection to the actual Egyptian language, not Reformed Egyptian, and Smith having access to that in his day and using symbols that are very similar to those. So there's that. What's
I do
Vogel
have a
saying here?
quote.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please.
so I think he's disagreeing, but I'll see if I understand him correctly. First, I'll read it. Some of the characters Stout offers are simple right angles, crosses, circles, shapes, like the numbers 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Stout calls this a dead-on resemblance, but it is totally unconvincing to me. And I think, Dan, and you can say if I got you right here in the comments, that I think what you're saying, that these are maybe more simple characters that could be made up and maybe aren't necessarily copies. And I would agree, because I do, there are some languages, despite having very different writing systems, will have one similar to the one, like if we look at the far right column, the third one down, that just kind of looks like a T. I know that there are characters in Japanese that look similar to that. I think that's what you're saying, Dan. Anyway, and I would agree for some of the more simple things. I think it's reasonable to think that this is what the human brain could come up with without influence, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're making a good point, which is across lots of languages, when it comes to symbols for things, the same sorts of symbols tend to get used. M's and
I would say the
W's.
simpler.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they show
Yeah.
up in other languages meaning something completely different, but the human brain seems to be drawn to certain symbols over and over again.
Yeah.
So,
Whereas
yeah.
I do think like the very first one, that one is more I think the more complicated and the more strokes that there tend to be, that's where
Yeah.
I would think that copy. So that the first and the second one, even with the lines like right next to a three, but that's just my I don't uneducated, but it is partially educated
Yeah.
opinion. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm just saying that.
And then, like, on the far right, the very top one, maybe in
Yeah,
the
that one's
middle row, the second one is sort of intriguing. Um, but yeah, I think you're right. I think there's overlap in various languages, but at least some of these look a little interesting. Okay. Is it your turn?
your turn.
My turn. The parallels between the circumstances of the Detroit Manuscript and the alleged discovery of Joseph Smith's ancient record suggest a shared inspiration behind the Book of Mormon's origin. Um, maybe. While the full story of the Gold Bible business in the Book of Mormon's publication may never be fully revealed, every piece of evidence sheds light on Mormonism's hidden genesis. And to that, I agree. How Joseph Smith put together the Book of Mormon, while we have ideas of where things came from, the actual putting it together, taking stories from his life, taking stories from sermons of his day, taking uh, things from other places, as Terrell Givens calls it, a bricolage, as Anthony Miller calls Joseph Smith an eclectic aggregator. How he did it, I think, will probably go forever with us never really knowing, because the kind of evidence that would need to come forward for us to have insight into how that happened is almost impossible to come forward. And so I think that will remain a mystery forever. While the full story of the Gold Bible business and the Book of Mormon's publication may never be fully revealed, every piece of evidence sheds light on Mormonism's hidden genesis. The secretive beginnings of Mormonism, including the Gold Bible business and events like William Morgan's disappearance in 1826, hint at covered dealings between Smith and Cowdery. Uncovering these schemes, as ancient wisdom suggests, brings hidden truth to light. Now, again, that's a very biased point of view. I wouldn't word it that way. What was Dan saying there in the comment, Maven? Oh, I can't hear you. Sorry.
Yes, he was saying I would expect similarity using simple characters.
Yeah.
So I think I did get him right. To show direct influence, we need unique, complex characters or sequence, but we are not looking at the Detroit characters. We don't have those.
Yeah. So perfect. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
All right. And that is it, folks. That is the 1823 Detroit Manuscript in the connection it has to the Anthon Transcript. I actually put manuscript there, but it should have said transcript. Sorry about that. And folks, if you want to call in, let me throw that up. 662-667-6667 or 662 Mormons. The phone lines are open. I'll just say again, I don't see any connection here to Rigdon-Spalding. I think it would be a huge stretch. What I do think is that RFM's point, I think, absolutely holds true. There is a decent chance, maybe a good chance, that Joseph Smith would have been aware of the 1823 Detroit Manuscript, the story of it showing up in the news, him hearing the name of Samuel Mitchell being mentioned as somebody in New York who could deal with this stuff. Remember, they specifically send Martin Harris to New York to find experts. Harris is the one who claims that he sort of picked these people out. Mitchell takes a look at the Anthon Transcript. Obviously, Charles Anthon does. And I believe there's a third person who takes a look, and I don't know that we have the name of that person. Maybe we do somewhere. And at the very least, it shows that Smith could have known about that transcript and sort of orchestrated the characters and the connection to Samuel Mitchell. And it also just shows that this is in Joseph Smith's milieu, as RFM pointed out in his comments to us before we started the show. It shows that Joseph Smith's not the only one finding things, claiming their old documents. They have quote unquote ancient languages on them, and they get sent off to experts to get looked at in the same way that there are other people who have first visions, in the same way that there are other messiahs who come in the same time period as Jesus. And things aren't new. Things aren't the first time these things happen. And it at least shows that Joseph Smith could have sort of knew how these kinds of events play out and used that to his advantage.
Yeah, and he wasn't as
Please.
remarkable as we're taught to think
Mm-mm.
in the church. When I think back to my understanding of Joseph Smith and the first vision when I was a kid and the way that the story was told to me, it's just, compared to just how remarkably mundane it gets, the more that you learn and the more you can fill in. Because we're taught that it stood out, that none of the religions thought anyone could talk to God anymore, and that Joseph was hated for saying that he did. When you do actually know that this happened all the time, tons of people made these kinds of claims, so it wouldn't have been weird for Joseph Smith to say what he said. And not only that, but a lot of his copied what was kind of out there. It's useful. It's useful for us to know, but I also think these kinds of things are useful for another reason, which it's not just debunking or kind of tearing down these foundations, these false foundations that our lives have been built on, but in looking at, or at least in trying to figure out ways that this is still happening today, and maybe parallels, and we don't always necessarily have to learn from them. Like, I would say something that's in our current milieu is vampires and werewolf in fiction and theology. It's all over the place, and especially like during the Twilight years, it just every other show on the popular primetime had some kind of supernatural that they've got all of these kind of characters in, because it's the thing now. But what else can we look at to maybe see, again, with modern day scams, modern day woo peddlers, who is trying to maybe get one over on us by these same kind of narratives and these same kind of tactics? So I don't know if we've got some calls in the bank, but I'm interested maybe if the chat can find any similarities or it's applications to today that can help us kind of avoid maybe mistakes that our ancestors made in falling for these kinds of things. I would be
Yeah,
curious about that.
yeah, there's no calls yet. So folks, if you do want to call in, you want to ask anything about this episode, maybe we won't get any, that's okay too. I do want to note something similar to what you just said. Two good examples. Emanuel Swedenborg, Mormon connections there. So I'll put up here on the screen the quote. It's actually in two parts. So in 1758, a man by the name of Emanuel Swedenborg wrote a book about his visions of the afterlife. Swedenborg insisted that there are three heavens described as entirely distinct from each other. He called the highest heaven the celestial kingdom and stated that the inhabitants of the three heavens corresponded to the sun, moon, and stars. Now, the apologist is going to come in and go, God gave him a vision too, and he just knew a truth. But what's more reasonable is that Joseph Smith is aware of things like that and can incorporate them into his theology. Another good example is the word of wisdom. We get this idea, we're told a story that, Emma doesn't like the tobacco being spit on the ground. She complains to Joseph. Joseph goes into a room and prays, and he comes back out and he's got the word of wisdom, this health code of what we should take and what we shouldn't take. And it seems so novel to what we're told. It's so novel to Joseph Smith. It's this revelation that contains a completely new insight. And the reality is that there were health code books of the day that gave almost identically the same advice that Joseph Smith gives in the book or in the Word of Wisdom, section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And so it becomes really easy to start seeing that Joseph Smith is grabbing things from his milieu. And it's one thing if the apologist goes, well, Swedenborg got a vision beforehand. But when you start naming 10, 20, 30 of those connections, the most rational answer by far is that Joseph Smith is simply borrowing from his milieu, and that he's not just magically, that the God's eternal truth just happens to line up with a bunch of people from Joseph Smith's day who are saying the exact same things. And so I think that
I
also
realized
speaks to what you were saying.
Yeah, the example I gave earlier, about the archaeological events and the aliens thing, I just realized that that is, I think, a modern parallel to this, and even more than other things, because it's kind of the same thing. Like, look, we are finding these archaeological remains. How could they possibly have come here? Well, it couldn't possibly have been the native people here were able to build that and had the knowledge to. So back then, the prevailing idea was that it's white people, it's Jews that God brought over here somehow, and they built those things and now they're gone. Whereas today it's aliens. It had to be aliens because human beings we can't see that we would have had, or our ancient our foregoers, our ancestors would have had the knowledge to be able to do the things that they did. And so it really is that is a modern, if you're following after that, I think it's likely that you would have also fallen for these kinds of things in Joseph Smith's time. That and the Swedenborg thing made me think of like the visions and near death experiences. I would say that's a huge thing going on right now that is legitimately capturing people's minds and imaginations, as we're seeing, like with the Lori and Chad Daybell stuff, which has been back in the news again because Chad Daybell was convicted of the of it, found guilty of the murder of not just JJ and Tylee, but other members of the family. And again, that's another thing where just this is all coming out from near death experiences, and the Visions of Glory book that is just really fueling this idea. And not just that, but also the child abuse that goes along with it. That's connected with the Frankie and Jody Hildebrandt, with this idea that there's demons in our children, and the way to get those demons out to save our children is any number of things, which, as we see, like the worst of it includes all the way up to death for the cases of JJ and Tylee. And with Ruby, frankly, her children were likely headed that way and were saved just in time before this attempt to save them ended up that bad. And there are Facebook groups now with religious, not just Mormon, but other Christians who genuinely like talk about these things, talk about demons in their children as if it's a real thing, and it's a real danger, I would say, to these fundamentalist children is the danger of their parents kind of falling for these things.
Yeah, and to go back to sort of borrowing from various places, I mean, again, we learn because of Thomas Wayment and Haley Lemond's research that Adam Clarke's commentary is used significantly in the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. And then I remember distinctly RFM then recognizing, and others were at the same time too, that Adam Clarke's commentary, there are points in Adam Clarke's commentary that make their way into other things going on in Mormonism. And so once you acknowledge that Joseph Smith has access to Adam Clarke's commentary, and maybe sort of early, you can start to go like, oh, like how much does that commentary impact Joseph's ability to take things from it and put it into various parts of his work? So I just want to note that that's possible too. And then let's just not fool ourselves. Chris Nemelka, who, if anybody knows him, I mean, maybe he's a genius, but he's certainly not the Lord's prophet. He's a scam artist. And he has done the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. And it is, 500, 600, 660 pages of revealed scripture, the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. And you go, and I always hear believers go, I don't know. I mean, I know you're pointing out all these things that Joseph did that go into the Book of Mormon, but man, I just don't know how somebody could just make a 531 page book. And I have faith in it. Well, here's another guy who had no problem doing a bunch of pages of a similar sort of production. He certainly did it in the modern day. Maybe he, had a chance to do it in a different way, and you can write it off that way, but he still did it. James Strang still did it. All those folks did. So we do have a phone call. We'll take that, and then we'll wrap up the show here. Okay. So,
and Dan says he's got a video about the characters where he compares them side by side, and our Mosiah also says it's a great video. So we've got a testimonial here.
Dan, if you can share that link, that would be great. If you've got a link to your episode, please put it in the comments. I
I
think
don't
folks,
Yeah,
please.
maybe it'll work. I don't know. Sometimes the comments will prevent links, but I guess we'll see, Dan, and if not, you can text it to me or Bill, and
Yeah,
we'll get
we
it
can
up.
either add it to the show notes or if it goes in the live chat. Folks, if you're watching this after the fact, please have the live chat off to the side of the screen because you're missing a bunch if you're missing Dan Vogel's input on our episodes. He really adds, I think, a fun dynamic to what we do here at Mormonism Live, having a highly regarded Mormon scholar watching our show every week and putting his 2 cents in when we cover historical issues. And I couldn't be more grateful for you, Dan. Thank you so much. Okay,
Sam.
so caller, what's the name?
This is Ted.
Ted, how are you again? Welcome to Mormonism Live.
I'm good. How are you, sir?
Good, good. What are you thinking,
Yeah,
my friend?
I didn't have much to add, but there was no way I was going to not call in after Maven did such a great job. And Maven, I'm just going to tell you, your speech last week, whoa, that brought a tear to my eye. But anyways, so I don't believe that Joseph Smith did anything more than I just believe he was a total scam artist. And I like some of the things today, like even on watching YouTube with the ads of today, everything is this new device, blah blah blah, like has taken America by storm. And on everyone, it's the same thing. And I just believe that there's catchphrases that catch people and bring them in. And anyways, yeah, that's all I had to say, guys. But I had to at least have one caller come in.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Ted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted.
All right, I'll end that.
All right.
Thank you, Ted.
Yeah.
Anything else from you, Maven? Otherwise, we'll just close out the show. I just want to say, Maven, I appreciate you a bunch. You sort of agreed to co-host this show about 30 seconds before we went live. And we wish
and you left for a second too. I was like, I'm gonna start the show. I'll carry it. I'll do the whole thing.
Yeah. And I just want to say
I didn't do any of the research for it, but yeah. So I'm glad that you came back at least.
Yeah. And I just want to note we're gonna send good vibes out to RFM and with what he's dealing with. And I'm hoping maybe we can sort of get some information on that at some point, but want to respect that he had to deal with something and had to take off, and hope everything is okay on his end. Anything else from you, Maven?
No. Well, Matt's asking if there's been a response from Jacob, and not that I'm aware of, but he did have a hard last week as well. I think Chad Daybell wasn't the only person convicted guilty of things, so it's probably a rough week for him.
Yeah.
Condolences.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thanks,
folks,
everybody.
Yeah, folks. Thank you.
Please. We'll be back next week. Yeah. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Please like and subscribe. Leave your comments either here in the live chat as we wrap up or down below. Folks, please like, subscribe, and share the video. And then I'll finish off here with one last little thing. We really do depend deeply on donations. I hate to always be asking, but that's how we survive. And we don't, we sell a little bit of merchandise. I think we've sold maybe 1 or 2 things this year. It's not been much. So buying merchandise helps us out. But more importantly, if you could send $5 a month or $10 a month. And so I'll just share a little message here and close out the show with this. Hello, friends of Mormon Discussion Incorporated. I'm Bill Reel, founder and CEO, reaching out to our incredible community. Our mission is to support those examining the truth claims of Mormonism and those redefining their relationship with it. Our acclaimed lineup of podcasts, including Mormonism Live, Radio Free Mormon, Mormon Discussion, and others, offers a space for truth and healing. But we need your help. Your donations power our work, expanding our outreach, improving our content, and creating new initiatives. Visit MormonDiscussions.org, click the donate button, and make a difference today. Donate to your favorite show, like this one, as your support empowers us to empower others. Thank you for being a part of the change. Together, we're making